Welcome to Brussels, the home of the European Union, or at least rather a lot of it. Wherever you live, whether you live outside Europe or within the EU, people that live and work here have a major impact on what products you buy, and increasingly what even you see on the internet. How does it work? What is the future of EU government as the world splits into competing trade blocs? That's a critical question. The limitations of EU government and how it will change is crucial for the whole world. So let's look at that on today's Trumpet World.
Now, what's so important about Brussels in Belgium? That's what Herbert W. Armstrong wrote in 1961 in his Plain Truth magazine. He talked about the new modern glass and concrete buildings going up, and wrote, "If you're in a tourist group, your guide will proudly point it out as the new capital of Europe. Here you can see with your own eyes that prophecy coming to fulfillment," he wrote. Actually, it is the headquarters of Euromart, the new European market of Europe. Already it is being called the new capital of Europe. Everyone here seems to realize and take for granted that the new common market is only the start. It is going to develop into a united political power. Here in Brussels, you can see Bible prophecy being fulfilled. So let's take a look around Brussels on today's show.
Somewhere in the region of 30 to 40,000 people work for the EU across its various different buildings. So let's take a quick look at some of them at the start. And this is the Belgium building, which houses the European Commission, the Executive Office. The Executive is not a president, it's a committee led by a president. And this is the Charlemagne building, the Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs, the Directorate General for Trade, and the Internal Audit Service of the European Commission is over there. So basically, tens of thousands of staff all throughout this city.
This is the Europa building. It's the home of the European Council and the Council of the European Union, which are two different things, and not to be confused with the Council of Europe, that is an entirely separate body with a separate headquarters in a separate city. This is the Justus Lipsius building. It's a staff office for the Council of the European Union. There are tens of thousands of staff here, like I said, with many more office buildings. I won't take you through all of them. Just mention a couple more. This is the Triangle building, the headquarters of the European Diplomatic Service, and the Kortenberg building with the headquarters for the Common Security and Defence Policy of the European Union.
Behind me is the Paul-Henri Spaak building, which houses the European Parliament, at least part of the time. And Parliament is the most democratic and most powerless part of the European Union. It came about because, well, the EU talks a lot about democracy, but that made it a bit awkward that it was run entirely by unelected bureaucrats. So they made themselves a parliament. But this parliament can veto legislation, but it can't initiate and it can't repeal. And in practice, mostly it tweaks and then rubber stamps whatever it is told to by the European Commission. And its official home is in Strasbourg. That's the famous Tower of Babel-like building. And basically, because of internal squabbles, between the French and others, you ended up with two buildings that they hike between at great cost to the taxpayer. Sorry, that's a lot of buildings and a lot of organizations. We'll take a break from them at a park local to a lot of these EU buildings. But all this confusion is kind of the point. There's not a lot of people that can follow the various different EU structures, even within the EU itself. People don't care about EU government as much as they do national government. A German is going to be much more closely connected to the German government and what's happening in Berlin than they are what's happening in Brussels. That's much more obviously and directly affects his life. It's more bound up in his sense of self. Do you care about the UN government anywhere near as much as you care about your own country? Of course not. So with people not really caring about the EU government as much, it's very easy for it to become this big confusing mess. And yeah, with all these acronyms, it is hard to follow. And all of these very similar sounding names, the European Council, the Council of the European Union, and the Council of Europe, and they're all different things. And the result of those two things, of people not really caring as much and it all being very confusing, is a lot of corruption that no one would get away with really in a modern Western national government. There are thousands of staff here in Brussels that earn more than the British Prime Minister. EU staff have awarded themselves, and especially MEPs, they've awarded themselves a special low tax rate that ordinary workers don't get. And in addition to very generous salaries, you look at MEPs, for example, while they get a very generous expense allowance, no receipts required, they get chauffeur-driven Mercedes cars, they eat subsidized fine food and fine drink within the European Parliament, even free often. They get 350 euros just for showing up to work as a daily allowance, and there's rampant reports of abuse of MEPs signing up to say that they're there in the office at the European Parliament and then immediately leaving, just so they can pocket that money. Now they've had to tighten things up because of that, so that if they miss more than half of the roll call votes, well, their daily allowance gets cut in half. So they have a reduced bonus if they just sign in and leave immediately. There's also second jobs. The average MEP earns about $12,000 a year from second jobs. They get very generous travel allowances for first class travel. You get generous pensions for ex-EU staff, but they lose it if they criticize the EU. And there is the very rampant out-and-out corruption. A few years ago, you had a big scandal where representatives of Qatar were caught handing out bags of cash to MEPs. Last month, the allegations, the latest was Huawei, this Chinese firm, giving smartphones, football tickets, or just cash for influence within Europe. Other bits of corruption that go on here in Brussels are pretty familiar to other democracies, especially in the United States. For example, you have the revolving door where people craft regulation and they do it so that it favors one particular business, and then they leave their job crafting regulation and get hired by that business and get given very lucrative salaries for not doing very much. You get that in the US Defense Department. You get that going on a lot within the European Union. So, okay, what do all of these people do? How does it affect you? Like I promised I'd tell you at the beginning. Well, so many aspects of our lives are governed by detailed yet often invisible regulation. Your food, your car, your bank, your travel, how your posts on social media are moderated and shared, what information your smartphone can collect about you, what standard your children's toys must meet, how your car seat keeps your kids safe, how your computer locates the websites that you're looking for, how you can find this video, whether you can even find this video. These regulations have huge effects on your life, and these are decisions that often have pros and cons. Tougher car safety standards, for example, could save your life, but then they may make your car more expensive to buy and to run. An obscure detail in food regulation could end up costing you hundreds or even thousands of dollars in a food budget, or it could mean that you're able to eat much more healthily. So these are the kind of decisions that you would expect elected personnel to be taking, but in so many places and in so many cases, these important decisions are not taken by national governments, and instead these rules get written up by all kinds of obscure groups. And so much of that, no matter where you are in the world, comes back to right here in Brussels. And the presence of many of these regulations isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's handy to have Bluetooth headphones purchased in one country be able to work in another. So that kind of international cooperation is quite helpful. But it also then opens the door for unelected bureaucrats being the one that decides all of these different things. These regulations are often managed by remote organizations and technical commissions. And you look at these rules and where they come from, and you see that the EU has a huge amount of clout. Columbia law professor Anu Bradford wrote about this in her book, The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World. And she writes, today, few Americans are aware that EU regulations determine the default privacy settings on their iPhone or the type of speech that Twitter will delete as unacceptable. EU law determines how timber is harvested in Indonesia, how honey is produced in Brazil, what pesticides cocoa farmers use in Cameroon, what equipment is installed in dairy factories in China, what chemicals are incorporated in plastic toys in Japan, as well as how much privacy is afforded to internet users in Latin America. This Brussels effect is similar to the California effect. California is the most populous state in the US, and it has some of the strictest laws. And businesses want to sell to the 40 million or so people living in California, so they make their products comply with California's regulations, And then they sell all their products across all the United States, conforming to those same regulations. It's not cost effective to have one set of products just for California and another set for the rest of the United States. You get the same thing happening on a global scale with the EU. The EU has a population of around 450 million relatively rich consumers. It's one of the biggest and most lucrative markets in the world, bigger even than the United States in terms of population. And it has some of the world's toughest regulation. It's often more cost-effective for big businesses to apply these same standards everywhere in the world. And EU regulation is becoming more and more pervasive. Every time the EU signs a trade deal, like the one that they have already signed and they're currently going through ratifying with Mercosur, the Latin American trade bloc, well, the percentage of the world conforming to the EU standards expands. Conforming to these rules are often a condition of signing these free trade deals. And then often many of these smaller trade blocs, like those in Africa, just copy and paste EU rules. They can't fund a big government with huge committees of experts to draw these up like the EU does. And the EU signs a lot of trade deals. They've got 50 preferential trade agreements compared to 18 for Japan, 14 for the United States. Bradford writes that the EU can use its vast market size as an asymmetric bargaining chip that allows it to demand significant changes for other countries' rules. Then the EU makes it very easy for people to copy these rules. They go out of their way to help people do that. It provides technical expertise to draft up local variants of EU rules. EU rules are quite handily already translated into Spanish, French, Portuguese. So again, makes it very easy for a whole lot of countries around the world to use them. And then also American law relies less on central authorities and more on court judgments than the EU law does. But that makes it harder to go and copy US law. European laws with their stronger central authority are much easier to kind of keep rolling out in different countries. And so the World Health Organization follows European principles in its Codex Amelioratis Commission, which sets global food standards. The United Nations Economic Commission for Europe has exported EU car safety standards to Latin America and Asia, etc., etc. And big business actually becomes an ally in exporting all this regulation. That could sound a bit counterintuitive because this imposes a lot of costs on businesses. They have to spend millions on lawyers, on other equipment, fees, getting things certified. But that's not a major cost for a big business. It's not a massive percentage of their turnover. For a small business, for a startup, that may be prohibitive. That might keep them out of that market altogether. And these rules and regulations are a hot topic right now with Donald Trump's trade tariffs and trade deals. It's these regulations, more than anything else, that restrict trade between the US and the EU. Many products made in the US are not legal here. And there's nothing to stop then an American firm reaching EU specifications. But that adds additional costs to what they're meeting to make it reach their domestic regulations in the United States. And one area you probably increasingly bumping up against this is the way the EU wants control of Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Twitter worldwide. They want to determine what can be said on these platforms worldwide. And for social media, it's easier to have one kind of regulation team that enforces this tougher EU standard than to have multiple standards in multiple countries. Now, on this issue, there has also been a whole lot of pushback. And EU is even looking at fining American social media giants as part of this trade war with the United States. But a lot of these social media sites are now starting to think, well, maybe we just need to keep paying the EU fines rather than impose EU regulation on our American customers, because generally the American customers do not want to be policed in what they can say the way that the EU demands that they do. But this global reach of the EU says a lot about its ambitions. So where does the EU come from? That's going to be crucial to understand where the EU is going and whether this is just a bureaucratic annoyance and a trade impediment or something much more seriously. We'll take a break, come back and look at that in more detail. Welcome back to our special on-location Trumpet World episode here in Brussels. I'm standing out in front of Brussels' iconic Arc de Triomphe, not to be confused with the various other Arc de Triomphes available in lots of different parts of the world. But if you look around at Brussels, and you look particularly at who things are named after, it gives you a very good insight into what the EU's founders revered, what their ambitions are for this union, where it is going. And apart from the older Brussels architecture, like the Arc de Triomphe behind me, of the EU, probably one of the most iconic buildings is the Paul Henry Speck building, which is where we opened the very beginning of the show. Paul Henry Speck was one of the EU's founding fathers, and he was one of Belgium's homegrown ones. But you might be a bit surprised at the background of this individual that is so revered by the EU that they named their parliament building after him. As a member of the Belgian Workers' Party before the war, he praised, and I quote, some of Hitler's magnificent achievements. In 1937, he said that the hour of Belgian National Socialism has come. He urged Belgium to remain neutral rather than join France against Germany in the war. Why would the EU be so keen on a Nazi sympathizer? The idea of some kind of economic union had been buzzing around Germany decades before the EU got started, which is another reason why I think this arch here with its obvious resemblance to the Brandenburg Gate is an appropriate location to record this segment. Germany itself got started as kind of an economic union. In the 19th century, Germany was divided among dozens of different states and principalities with different kings and princes ruling them. And they initially came together as an economic union before Otto von Bismarck forged them into the German Empire, a single state. And very quickly, Germany began talking about doing the same thing for Europe. They saw in their own union a model that could be copied to unite all of Europe into one country. In World War I, this was exactly what Germany talked about doing if they won the war. Their war aims called for an economic union where, I quote, all its members will be formally equal, but in practice will be under Germany's leadership and must stabilize Germany's economic dominance over Middle Europa. And historian Niall Ferguson has talked about, if you look at what Germany's aims were for World War I, it really isn't all that different to the European Union. In the 1930s and in the 1940s even, the Nazis talked about exactly the same thing. They spoke about a European family of nations, or even a European community, which would experience, quote, rapidly increasing prosperity once national economic barriers are removed. They used the term Großwarenwirtschaft, or large economic area, and this became a common talking point in their propaganda. In 1936, Hitler himself told the Reichstag that the European people represent a family in the world. It is not very intelligent to imagine that in such a cramped house like that of Europe, a community of people can maintain different legal systems and different concepts of law for very long. And they reached for this idea most of all in the 1940s, where they had conquered just about all of Europe, and they wanted to get everybody used to being part of this German-dominated empire. You know, going and telling the French and the Belgians and the Dutch, you are German subject people, you're part of a new German empire, that's not going to motivate them to get behind you very much. And they were struggling. This idea was talked about most of all in France, where they were struggling against the French resistance, and France struggling to be independent of Germany. So instead, they dusted out this idea of a European economic community, a European economic union. It's a much more palatable way to sell the situation. Hey, you're not part of the German Empire, you're part of a European economic alliance. And so in the summer of 1940, Hermann Göring began putting together plans for the large-scale economic unification of Europe. And in the same year, the German ambassador to France, Otto Abetz, wrote to Hitler recommending that Germany, quote, usurp the European idea as a means of controlling France. And he said, well, you should do it in the same way that Hitler, quote, usurped the idea of peace before the war. The Nazi official steering these plans, revealingly enough, was the former, quote, Public Enlightenment and Propaganda State Secretary, yes, that was an official job, Walter Funk. He became the economics minister and president of the German Central Bank. He was, of course, later tried for war crimes, and he was labeled the banker of the golden teeth because of all the teeth he confiscated from Jews in the Holocaust. But Foote developed Goering's plans. He called it the European Economic Community and outlined it in a series of papers that came out in 1941. Now, of course, decades later, in 1957, what is now the EU had exactly the same name, the European Economic Community. In his book, The Rotten Heart of Europe, Bernard Connolly wrote, that blueprint bore a quite startling resemblance to the European Economic Community of the Treaty of Rome, as modified by the Single European Act and the Treaty of Maastricht, foreshadowing the agricultural, industrial, and regional policies and trans-European networks advocated by the more fervent Eurocrats. In 1942, the Nazis organized a conference called the European Economic Community. The German Foreign Ministry set up a European Committee. By the next year, they drafted formal plans to have this declared at a European conference. The German Foreign Minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, called for it to be set up as soon as Germany had a significant military victory. That never came, and so it was never set up. But many of these same officials that were working on blueprints and papers and putting together these ideas went on to play a critical role in the European Union. The head of the Reich's credit company, for example, Dr. Bernard Benning, he spoke at the 1942 European Economic Community Conference. And his speech was entitled The European Currency Question. Well, he went on to become a senior figure at the Bundesbank, the German bank, and played a major role in putting together what is now the euro and the Eurozone. And as an aside, I think that brings up another important building, one that we've not filmed or photographed for you today, and that is the head of the European Central Bank, because it's not here in Brussels. That's in Germany, that's in Frankfurt. And that tells you a lot about who really controls the European Union, who has access to the purse strings. And the EU itself isn't able to tax directly, they can't borrow money, they're reliant on member states for that. So much of how the finances of the EU is controlled happens because of the European Central Bank. And when you understand the whole reasoning behind why Germany had this idea for a European Union, it's very clear why they kept control of that bank. They wanted to, again, replicate what they'd done within Germany. They saw that Germany, as the largest member of this European Union, would effectively control it, in the same way that Prussia was the largest state that went into the German Empire, and the Prussian king went on to become the German emperor and controlled the whole state. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody involved in setting up the EU was doing it for these reasons as a vehicle for German ambition. There were some who were doing it, I think, because of the same reasoning, but they thought in the post-war Europe, France would be the dominant force. France hadn't been crushed and defeated in the same way that Germany did. They were one of the victors. And so I think they thought that France would end up as the dominating figure of the European Union. But there's another critical EU founding father to understand that points to the ambitions of those that set up the European Union. And that is Robert Schuman. And his name is all over here. His statue is out kind of near a busy road, so I couldn't really film in front of it, but that's just over there. The station that you come out to get here and to get to so many of these EU buildings is the Schuman station. The Schuman roundabout is under construction right now, but that's the heart of all of these, where all of these different EU buildings intersect. And Robert Schuman speaks to another route and another vision behind the European Union. We'll take a quick break and we'll talk about him in just a minute. Just next to me, you should be able to see a little bit of the bust of former French Prime Minister Robert Schuman as he looks down the main thoroughfare towards the Berlaymont building, the Charlemagne building, and all of the main European buildings. Now, Robert Schuman, he was a Prime Minister, but he is on the path to sainthood. Pope Francis recognized his, quote, heroic virtues. And the Vatican is looking around for miracles that he may have performed so that he can be beatified and canonized. And that does seem the potential and eventual path that he's on, to become Saint Robert Schuman. What does a politician, a former Prime Minister of France, have to do to be made a saint? Well, the answer reveals some critical features of the European Union. Schuman is one of the founding fathers of the European Union. His Schuman Plan proposed the European Coal and Steel Community, a trading union that was to pave the way to political union. And it's pretty rare for a politician to be made a saint. The last man canonized for his political work and to be made a full saint for his political work was Thomas More, who opposed Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn. That was quite a while ago. Thomas More died in 1535 and was made a saint in 1935. So you see, to be a political saint while opposing Britain splitting from the Catholic Church is one way, and supporting the creation of the European Union is another way. In 1962, as the EU developed, Britain's Topic magazine, which back then was quite a popular newspaper or magazine, said the Vatican, usually cautious over political changes not of its own inspiration, now considers the common market the work of divine providence. Not since the time of Spain's Charles V has a Roman Catholic political force been so strongly wielded. Not since the end of the Holy Roman Empire has the Vatican been offered a Catholic rallying point like the common market. If the Pact of Rome, which created the common market, had been signed within the Vatican's walls, it could not have favored the Church more. And in his book, The Principality and Power of Europe, which really looks at the origins of the European Union, Adrian Hilton writes, Europe's leaders and the Roman Catholic Church are still working together towards the common goal of unity. Many of Europe's political leaders see a crucial role for the Roman Catholic Church in their efforts, providing a powerful, cohesive common religion to hold Europe together politically. Many popes have supported the rise of the coming together of the European Union. Pope John the 23rd said that Catholics should be in the front ranks of those supporting the European Union. Pope Paul VI said, can it not be said that it is faith, the Christian faith, the Catholic faith, that made Europe? It is there that our mission as bishops in Europe takes on a gripping perspective. No other human force in Europe can render the service that is confided to us, promoters of the faith, to reawaken Europe's Christian soul where its unity is rooted. And Pope Francis was no exception to this push for a European Union. Europe, find yourself, he wrote in a letter published in October 2020. Rediscover your most deeply rooted ideals. Be yourself. Do not be afraid of your millenary history, which is a window open to the future more than the past. So you look at the European Union and what its roots are. It's a fusion, really, of those that got started pushing the EU as a means for German domination of Europe, and the Catholic Church pushing Europe. And the Bible says a lot about those two forces combined. We'll go back to the studio now and take a look at what the Bible tells us about the roots of this European power.
I want to tell you a little more about it, and that is the coming of the United States of Europe. Now, brethren, you've heard me mention that time and again. And I think that perhaps we don't realize what a pivotal thing that is in world history and what it means to us especially. Well, I can tell you now that the whole world is soon going to be rocked with astonishment and amazement when they find that possibly within a year now, there is a new supernation, a new superpower, possibly greater than the Soviet Union or the United States, has gone together in Europe. The prophesied resurrection of the so-called medieval Holy Roman Empire, the United States of Europe.
That is from a 1982 sermon from Herbert W. Armstrong. He made a lot of very precise forecasts like that on the future of Europe. What everything that we were looking at in the first half is going to turn around and turn into. Welcome back to Trumpet World. I'm back home in our UK-based studio for this second half of the show, where I wanted to dig a bit deeper into Bible prophecy and why Mr. Armstrong was able to make such precise and detailed forecasts about the European Union, and how precisely what the Bible says about that union matches what you see when you go and look around Brussels and around Europe. I mean, right from 1945, with Germany defeated, Mr. Armstrong said it would rise again as, quote, a European Union. He used that exact phrase. And the Bible forecasts, like I said, exactly the Europe that we have just described. And look at Europe today and you see a ton of fulfilled prophecy. And we finish by looking at the role that the Catholic Church has played in the creation of Europe. And this is a great place to start digging into Bible prophecy, because this is exactly what the Bible prophesied. Revelation 17 describes this European power in tremendous detail. But it begins by describing who controls this European power. It talks about a great whore. Verse 2 of Revelation 17 says that this woman with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Verse 4 describes her as a woman arrayed in purple and scarlet color and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. It's describing a very wealthy church. A woman is a church in Bible prophecy, and in biblical symbolism, this is a great false church that heavily influences and rules over the political empire. And Revelation 13 describes the same thing in different symbolisms. Revelation 13 begins by describing a great beast, an empire in Bible prophecy. That's very easy to prove. Daniel 7 talks about the rise of various different kings and kingdoms, and it uses king and kingdom interchangeably, and it describes them as beasts. So this Revelation 13 begins by describing a political beast, a standard empire that we're used to seeing in the world today. But then verse 11 says, "And I behold another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon, and he exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and he caused the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed." So this is another beast that looks like a lamb. It looks like the Church of Jesus Christ to many people in this world. And it's, though, concerned about what people worship. He had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. It sets up the image of the beast and has people worship it. Well, the Catholic Church has set itself up in the image of the old Roman Empire. And that is the beast, the political beast that is being described initially. And it is organized and it has set up its church in the image of that empire. The Roman Empire was set up with dioceses. The Catholic Church is organized around dioceses. It's based in Rome. It's led by a Pontifex Maximus. This is what Philip von Ness-Myers wrote in his book Ancient History. Long before the fall of Rome, there had begun to grow up within the Roman Empire an ecclesiastical state, which in its constitution and in its administrative system was shaping itself upon the imperial model. So they shaped themselves on the Roman model. This is from Paul Johnson, himself a Catholic, in his book A History of Christianity. He says, "In the long struggle to suppress internal division, to codify its doctrine, and to expand its frontiers, Christianity had become in many striking ways a mirror image of the empire itself." He wrote that it was administered by a professional class of literates who in some ways function like bureaucrats, and its bishops, like imperial governors, legates, or prefects, had wide discretionary power to interpret the law. It was becoming the doppelganger of the empire. And he said Christianity had become a secular as well as a spiritual phenomenon. There's a state element to this church, so that's why it's represented still as a beast. But it was a doppelganger. It was set up in the image of the empire. It got people worshipping the image of the Roman Empire, the image of this first beast. So all of this tells us that the Catholic Church is going to play a dominant role, a guiding role in this United States of Europe that is going to rise up out of the current EU. And we see this in the crucial role that the Catholic Church has already played in the creation of the European Union. We talked about quite a lot of this in the first half, but you see it even how it's baked into European symbolism. I mean, you see it in all of those EU flags that are all over the place in Brussels. 12 stars on a blue background. Why 12 stars? I mean, if you're familiar with the US flag, you might think, well, maybe it's because there's 12 member states in the European Union, but there's not, there's 27. Well, okay, well, maybe there were 12 when they created the flag, or maybe it started with 12. Neither of those are true. And in fact, we have to turn to the book of Revelation, really, to understand why there are 12 stars. Because it says in Revelation 12 and verse 1, "There appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars." This is describing God's church here, a woman symbolically picturing God's church. She has a crown of 12 stars. Now, the Catholic Church says that this is describing Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so whenever Mary is depicted, she's often depicted in Catholic imagery and iconography with having 12 stars. And so one of the flag's designers, Arsene Heitz, he said the flag of Europe is the flag of Our Lady. So it's claiming, you see its Catholic heritage, even just in the most common symbol of the European Union, the flag. It's all about a church that claims to be Christ's church, that is in the limit, or the church Christ started, that has the image of the Lamb, dominating and guiding that European Union. Now, like we talked about, the Catholic Church was very invested in getting the European started. A lot of those running the European Union today, though, would prefer a much more secular union. A lot of those bureaucrats that are working and living in Brussels don't want to be guided by a church at the moment. They don't want a church on top of them. They'd prefer to be the final authority. And with their expertise, they want to be the ones crafting the rules that the world follows. So we're expecting some big changes, and you can watch for the Catholic Church to once again play a decisive role in Europe and within the European history. Mr. Fleury explained in an April 2006 article how this would happen. He said, throughout Europe's history, what has helped it to overcome its divisions has been a unity of purpose between church and state. Charlemagne showed how strong Europe could be when he formed a partnership between Germany and the Roman Catholic Church to create the Holy Roman Empire. That empire has risen up repeatedly since then, but this church-state union hasn't always been a happy marriage. Usually the two have been drawn together because of a crisis, an emergency. Herbert W. Armstrong believed the same pattern would occur in our time, that European nations would unite suddenly because of a crisis, and that the Roman Catholic Church would play a huge role in solving that emergency. In times of crisis, religion has a way of pulling people together. And he said crises are developing that could lead to this emergency that will cause Europe to look to a newly strengthened Germany and end up bringing church and state together, from the weakening of the US economy to danger brewing in the Middle East. The road ahead in Italy and Europe is chaotic and uncertain, but the Bible makes it clear that this is the final destination for Europeans, a union of church and state that forms one of the strongest powers in history. So there's going to be some transformations happening in Europe. You will see a crisis, and you'll see as a result of that crisis, the Catholic Church taking on an even stronger role. Those European bureaucrats would love to rule it themselves without the Catholic Church, but they'll see that they can't do that and that they need the Catholic Church to help unify Europe. This is a clip from Mr. Armstrong from his World Tomorrow program in 1982, where he talked also about the role that the Catholic Church will play and talked about an additional dimension to the unification role that it would play here.
Now, why the delay in this United States of Europe? It is a resurrection of the medieval Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was started in the year of 554 after the fall of the major ancient Roman Empire, but at the behest of the Pope at Rome, Justinian, the ruler of the East in Constantinople, was brought to Rome, and he revived what they called the Roman Empire. But it became known as the Holy Roman Empire. And it lasted until after Napoleon in 1814 AD. Now, ever since, the nations in Europe have wanted to reunite, and I've been foretelling it. The Bible foretells it. Just as I did foretell World War II, now I'm foretelling World War III. People scoffed. They didn't believe it then. It happened. Some people may be scoffing today. It will happen. And you can bet your life on that, because you are betting your life on it. Now, why has it not come sooner? Why has it been so long? And I have known it was coming for almost 50 years now. Well, in Europe, they are divided by different language barriers. There's so many different languages. For example, there is German, English, Spanish, French, Italian, Greek, many different languages. They have various national aspirations that divide them, national patriotisms. Now, always in the so-called Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Church was the sort of cementing agent that cemented the nations together and brought them together religiously, and Bible prophecy says will be once again. Even religion in Europe has been divided between the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church in the East. They have been absolutely divided.
And Mr. Armstrong went on to talk about the way that the Catholic Church is going to unite Christianity religiously. This world's Christianity, that is. It's going to unite the Orthodox religions and Protestant religions, and that's going to help it bring Europe together. This is something you can expect as the Catholic Church selects a new pope. So it's going to take the Catholic Church to unite Europe, and it's taken them a while to get together in the way that they really want to, with this really solid United States of Europe political union. Though they've made many strides in that direction, it's taken them a while because they're trying to do it without the Catholic Church, some of them. And it may take a crisis, and then they'll realize we need the Catholic Church to unify everyone. Now, there are other important ways that the current setup of the EU ties perfectly in with Bible prophecy and also points us forwards to coming changes. And Mr. Armstrong, you'll note in that clip, you may have noticed he talked about resurrections of the Holy Roman Empire, and that what you see in Europe so many times is a resurrection of what has gone before. This is from an earlier edition of his radio show.
First, as I've been showing you in many, many broadcasts, the prophecies show a resurrection of the ancient Roman Empire in the approximate territory of the old Roman Empire. Remember, there was no settled, definite geographical boundary line because it continued to shift and to change through the years. The Roman Empire, as such, existed officially from about 31 BC until 476 AD, but then there were a number of resurrections of it, beginning with 554 on to 1814, as a matter of fact. And so once again, there is to be one more revival or resurrection. Actually, in a sense, Napoleon resurrected the Roman Empire. So did Mussolini, in a sense.
And this is exactly what the Bible prophesied. If we go back to Revelation chapter 17 and verse 9, it says, "And here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue a short space." This empire is resurrected 7 times. You have 1 king, the empire falls, someone comes along and resurrects it. And this is what happened. You had the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire fell in the West. You had the Byzantine Empire keep it going. Justinian reconquered Rome. Mr. Armstrong talked about that in one of those clips. The Byzantine Empire quickly declines in the West. The Pope anoints Charlemagne, and he anoints him Roman Emperor. He resurrects the Roman Empire in Charlemagne. Charlemagne dies, the empire falls apart. Decades later, the Catholic Church picks another family. Otto the Great of Germany, makes him empire. And his empire declines and falls, and so then the Habsburgs come along, and the Catholic Church plays again a massive and critical role, anointing the Roman Empire. And the Habsburgs, in return, try to stamp out the Protestant Reformation. The Habsburgs decline. Napoleon comes along. He calls himself a new Caesar, a new Charlemagne. He uses all of this Roman symbolism from the Roman Empire. And he has the Pope come and play a major role in his coronation. And then, of course, he falls, he's defeated. And then you get Hitler and you get Mussolini. And they base so much of their imagery on the Roman Empire. Mussolini is, in particular, talking about how he's reviving the Roman Empire, but Hitler's salute is based off of the Roman salute. They were using eagles and legions. They're resurrecting the Roman Empire. And all of these resurrections are steered, are guided by the Catholic Church, just like Revelation 17 talks about. I mean, verse 8 adds another dimension to these resurrections, rising and falling, where it says, "The beast that you saw was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition, and they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they beheld the beast that was, and is not, and yet is." You know, it goes underground. You have a resurrection, it rules, and then it disappears, and it seems like it's gone. It seems like it's completely disappeared, and then it comes right back up from the underground. And this is what we see with the EU. You had a resurrection of this Holy Roman Empire under the Nazis. And then they're defeated. They go underground. They seem to disappear. But then some of these pro-Nazis are working on the European Union, and plans put together by the Nazis are dusted off and reused for the European Union. It's part of this beast going underground. Revelation 17 also talks about an important part of Europe's future and points to this crisis that is coming for Europe shortly. Verse 12 says that, earlier in this chapter, it describes this beast having 10 horns. And then verse 12 says, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. There are 10 horns, 10 kings that rule together. This final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire is made up of 10 nations. This is why Mr. Armstrong in 1945 was saying, hey, it's going to be some kind of political union, some kind of European union, because he saw that it would be a union of 10 kings. God revealed that to him from these prophecies in Revelation 17 and elsewhere as well. There are other prophecies that tell us it will be made up of 10 kings. But this also tells us what's coming for Europe. Right now, Europe is made up of 27 different nations. It's going to shrink down to 10. That implies a pretty big crisis. That's some pretty big transformation that Europe's got to go through, where either you get nations kicked out of Europe, or you have an inner core of nations decide to move towards closer integration in the United States of Europe, leaving some of the rest behind. And Mr. Armstrong talked about 10 nations or groups of nations. Each king, maybe you have one king covering, say, both Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, one unit. We don't know exactly all of those details, but in 2009, after the financial crisis, Mr. Fleury wrote, however it happened, Germany is prophesied to come out on top in this financial crisis. Social unrest and riots will eventually force Europeans to succumb to a strong united government of Europe, led ultimately not from Brussels, but from Berlin. As we conclude this episode, that's going to happen as part of this transformation. As part of this shrink down to 10 nations, it'll also be under much closer, much stronger German control. And we might see Brussels' role as the capital of Europe diminishing, and Berlin taking that on much, much more. Germany is going to lead and dominate this United States of Europe as Mr. Armstrong forecast. But notice just a couple more things from Revelation 17. Verse 17 says, for God has put in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and to give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled. God is in control. Satan is the god of this world. It's Satan's world. Satan influences this beast and empowers this beast. The Bible's very clear on that. But God allows it to happen. And it is all happening in accordance with his will. And in context of that, we've read verse 10 already, where it talks about 5 are fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. Verse 12 talks about these 10 kings that have received no kingdom as yet. This prophecy in Revelation 17 is frozen at a specific moment in time. God prophesies too, within this chapter, that he would have a man on the scene through whom he would reveal what is happening. And all of this is right from the mind of God. He is prophesying thousands of years in advance the shape of European history, but also exactly when he would have a man on the scene, and he would reveal, he would unlock, God himself would unlock these prophecies, unseal these prophecies, and he would reveal them through a man to the whole world. And that happened through Herbert W. Armstrong. And he is included even in these prophecies here, that you would have a man on the scene when God unlocked this book of Revelation 17. And he's prophesied in other passages in the Bible. So there's a man, there's a church, there's a work that we can look through now to understand what is happening in Europe and what God's purpose is, how these nations are fulfilling all of God's will, what he's doing here. And even more than that, Revelation 17 shows that this one man that God is working with, he would disappear from the scene before the seventh resurrection appeared, before it had ascended out of the bottomless pit. And at that point, when you start to really see the European Union come together the way that it really has already, well, Mr. Armstrong would be gone, but there's again an implied prophecy that God would be working with another man at that point. that you would see another individual that God is working through and that God is revealing truth through. So these beasts, they're doing God's will. And God shows us exactly what he is doing. I think that brings me to one last quote from Mr. Armstrong. He wrote this in a 1965 Plain Truth magazine, where he said, "Anywhere you look, today's world news thunders the solemn warning. We are being hurled fast towards the end of this world. Of course, that means the ushering in of the happy new world of peace, the world tomorrow. But here in Brussels, capital of the European Common Market, I am more than ever impressed that this happy new world tomorrow is not going to be born without terrifying birth pangs, such as the world has never suffered before. I want very seriously to reveal to you what I see plainly here in Europe." So God used Mr. Armstrong to warn about the beast power that is swiftly rising. Now he's using Mr. Gerald Flurry to point back to what Mr. Armstrong said and to reveal new truth and to show what is happening in Europe. But Mr. Armstrong, when he wrote about this beast power, he was always doing it in context of this soon coming world tomorrow. That is what God is doing here. He's using this to usher in this soon coming world tomorrow. And we can't lose sight of that. Mr. Armstrong never did. And he always talked about it in that context. And you can learn more about what God is doing here and the purpose even behind this beast, as well as all of these detailed promises and as well as a lot of history where you can see the Bible being proved true before your eyes and Bible prophecy being proved true before your eyes. You can see all that in our free book, The Holy Roman Empire in Prophecy. You can get that on our website, thetrumpet.com. We'll be very happy to send that out to you, or you can read it online. Just go to the literature tab, and then if you change the view from showcase to all, you should be able to find that book, or we'll leave it a link to that in our show notes. Well, that is about all I've got time for. Thank you very much to George Haddad for engineering and production, and to Victoria Palmer for the on-location camera work. Thank you very much for joining us to what I hope was a bit of a special episode. We'll be back on Friday with our regular show. You can contact us with any feedback, comments at Trumpet World at thetrumpet.com. And until then, keep watching your world.